Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Overnight, Toan suddenly suffers a severe episode, trembling in pain, forcing Tu Diem to hold him tightly and rush him to the hospital in sheer fear. So what is really happening to Toan, and can he overcome this crisis to return to a normal life? Now, let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. That afternoon, Tu Diem and Toan returned home as the sun lowered. The road was familiar, yet their steps were slower. They walked side by side without saying much, not because they didn't want to talk, but because each of them was overwhelmed by too many thoughts. What had just happened was still there, unsettled, not yet ready to be put into words. When they reached home, Toan set his bag down and sat quietly for a moment. He lifted his hands and rubbed his temples. The movement was slow and heavy. Tu Diem noticed and asked if he was all right. Toan said he had a headache. He explained that the more he tried to think about what had happened, the worse the pain became, as if something were tightening inside his head. His voice was low without complaint, but clearly strained. Tu Diem sat beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. She told him not to force himself to remember. She said those things didn't need to be recalled right now. What mattered most was his health. Toan listened. He stopped trying to think. After a while, he said the pain eased slightly. They sat together and exchanged a few gentle sentences. They didn't mention the incident or anyone involved. They talked about everyday matters. What to eat for dinner. Whether they needed to wake up early the next day. The simplicity eased the tension just enough for them not to feel alone. They then went into the kitchen together. Tu Diem washed vegetables. Toan rinsed the rice. Each did a familiar task. No one rushed the other. Dinner was quiet, but not cold. Toan ate more slowly than usual. Tu Diem noticed and chose softer food for him. Toan tried to finish his portion. Afterward, they cleaned up and went to bed early. The night was restless. Toan turned over many times. Near dawn, he finally slept more deeply. Tu Diem woke early as usual. She turned but didn't see Toan getting up like he normally did. She thought he was tired and let him sleep. She went to wash up first. When she returned to the bed, she saw Toan still under the blanket. Something was wrong. The blanket moved slightly. Toan was trembling. He clutched his head tightly. His face was tense with pain. He murmured that it hurt, softly and brokenly. Tu Diem panicked. She rushed closer and called his name again and again. She asked where it hurt and whether he could hear her. Toan didn't answer. His eyes drifted away. His body curled inward, as if he were afraid of something he couldn't explain. Tu Diem's hands shook as she tried to hold him. Fear and confusion overwhelmed her. Without hesitation, Tu Diem took her phone and called Thu. She tried to summarize what had happened since the previous day, that Toan had been hit on the head, that he had suffered headaches all night, and that this morning his condition suddenly worsened, with trembling and no response when spoken to. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to explain each point clearly. On the other end, Thu listened carefully. He asked a few short questions to confirm the situation, then told her to stay calm. He said he would come immediately. As soon as the call ended, Thu's mother, who was sitting nearby, asked what had happened. Thu briefly explained everything. He said Toan had been struck on the head the day before, had previously suffered memory loss, and that his condition worsened that morning. Hearing this, his mother's expression changed. Worry and sympathy were clear on her face. She urged Thu to go there at once to check on Toan and Tu Diem and told him to report back immediately if anything happened. Thu nodded, grabbed his jacket and left right away. Back at the house, after ending the call, Tu Diem sat on the bed and held Toan in her arms. She cried and kept calling his name, asking if he could hear her, if he recognized her. Toan still didn't respond. He breathed rapidly, his hands pressed tightly against his head, as if fighting pain and fear he couldn't understand. A short time later, Thu arrived. As soon as he entered the room, he recognized that Toan's condition was serious. He sat beside the bed and spoke slowly and clearly, asking if Toan could hear him and where it hurt. Toan didn't react. His eyes avoided contact, as if trapped in his own fear. Thu turned to calm Tu Diem and told her not to panic. After a brief exchange, they agreed to take Toan to the hospital for examination. Thu helped lift Toan into the car. Tu Diem sat beside him, holding him tightly as tears continued to fall. At that moment, she had only one thought: to get him there as quickly as possible. The car stopped in front of the hospital just as the morning fully settled in. The air was still cold, carrying the familiar scent of antiseptic. Toan was helped out of the car slowly. Thu went ahead, speaking quickly but clearly with the medical staff. Tu Diem stayed close to Toan, one hand holding his arm, the other supporting his back, never stepping away, as if letting go for even a moment might cause him to collapse. Toan was taken into the emergency room. The white lights turned on. The space felt quiet but tense. The medical staff asked him to lie still. They checked his blood pressure, heart rate, and basic reflexes. Toan closed his eyes. His hands remained drawn close to his head, fingers clenched tightly. His breathing was fast and uneven, his chest rising and falling sharply. The doctor entered and asked short, direct questions. He asked whether Toan could hear him. He asked where the pain felt strongest. Toan did not respond. His eyes stayed shut, his face rigid. The doctor then turned to Tu Diem and asked her to describe what had happened before, requesting as much detail as possible. Tu Diem tried to remain calm. She explained that Toan had suffered memory loss earlier, and that his memory had only partially returned and was still unstable. There were things he could remember, but many parts of his past were still completely blank. She added that the previous afternoon, Toan had been stopped by two strangers, pushed to the ground and hit his head on the road. After that, there was light bleeding and persistent headaches. Each time he tried to recall past events, the pain intensified. That morning, his condition worsened. He began trembling, clutching his head, and no longer responded when spoken to. The doctor took careful notes, nodding slowly. He said further examination was necessary because multiple factors were overlapping. Toan was sent for head imaging and basic neurological tests. While waiting for the results, the doctor administered pain medication and a mild sedative to stabilize his condition. Tu Diem sat close beside the bed. She held Toan's hand tightly. His hand felt colder than usual. Each time his body shifted slightly or his breathing grew heavier, her grip tightened, as if reminding him that she was still there. Thu stood nearby, leaning against the wall. He didn't speak much, but his eyes followed every movement made by the doctor and nurses. After some time, the doctor returned with the results. He explained that Toan did not have a brain hemorrhage and no immediate life-threatening injury. However, there were signs of a mild concussion combined with prolonged psychological stress. The prior memory loss meant that Toan's brain had not fully recovered. When he forced himself to recall memories, the brain reacted defensively, causing severe headaches, trembling, and panic-like responses. The doctor emphasized that absolute rest was essential. Toan must not force memory recall. Mental pressure had to be avoided. Any memories, if they returned, should be allowed to surface naturally. The family needed to monitor him closely. If symptoms such as worsening headaches, strong tremors, confusion, or loss of consciousness appeared, he had to be brought back to the hospital immediately. Tu Diem listened to every word, nodding repeatedly. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She was afraid of missing something important. Thu asked a few brief questions to clarify home care instructions. The doctor answered clearly and directly. Gradually, the medication began to take effect. Toan's trembling eased. His breathing became steadier. His fingers loosened. He opened his eyes very slowly. At first, his gaze was unfocused, drifting around the room as if he didn't know where he was. When he saw Tu Diem sitting close beside him, he startled slightly and instinctively grabbed her hand. His breathing quickened for a moment, then slowly calmed. Toan asked softly where he was. His voice was weak and broken. He asked whether everything was over. Tu Diem leaned closer, crying as she reassured him. She told him he was in the hospital. She said everyone was there. She said she would not leave. Toan looked at her for a long time. His eyes softened, though fear still lingered, as if fragments of unnamed memories were still pressing against him. Standing nearby, Thu finally let out a quiet breath when he saw that Toan could recognize the person beside him. The doctor performed another brief check, asking simple questions to confirm responsiveness. He then said Toan could be discharged for home monitoring later that day, provided someone stayed with him at all times and followed instructions carefully. Before leaving the room, the doctor repeated his advice. Do not force memory recall. If Toan showed signs of fear or panic, respond calmly and gently. Do not question him repeatedly. Give his brain time to adjust and recover. On the way home, Toan leaned against Tu Diem's shoulder. He was exhausted, but no longer panicked like he had been earlier that morning. Tu Diem continued to hold his hand. Thu drove more slowly than usual, occasionally checking the rear-view mirror to make sure Toan was still stable. When they reached home, Toan was helped into bed. He lay down and closed his eyes. His breathing was steady. Tu Diem sat beside the bed and did not move. When Thu prepared to leave, Tu Diem stood and bowed her head slightly in thanks. Her voice caught as she spoke. Thu replied briefly, reminding her to call immediately if anything unusual occurred. After Thu left, the house fell quiet again. Tu Diem sat by the bed, watching Toan sleep. Her tears fell slowly, without sound. Not from weakness, but because fear had not completely faded. Still, she knew that for now, Toan had passed the immediate danger. A long day came to an end, leaving exhaustion behind and strengthening her resolve to stay with him, even though the path ahead remained uncertain.